Hey everybody, I'm Natasha Kirchek, and thanks for joining us for ILTV's weekly program, One-on-One with Alan Dershowitz. We want to give you, our viewers, a chance to have your questions answered by Professor Dershowitz, one of America's greatest legal minds. He's a leading expert on criminal and constitutional law, civil liberties, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Hi, Professor Dershowitz. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, good.
All right, so let's begin with our first guest. Joining us now in this studio is Seth Frantzman, the Executive Director of the Middle East Center for Reporting and Analysis and the op-ed editor of the Jerusalem Post. Now, Seth, the world has been waiting earnestly for U.S. President Donald Trump's decision to nix or fix the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Now, what is your take on all of the recent developments, beginning, of course, with this massive speech that the Israeli Prime Minister just gave with a very graphic presentation?
Well, I think now the ball is obviously in Donald Trump's court. I mean, Netanyahu wants to show that Iran, as he said, is lying. And we're at a huge amount of tensions now in the Middle East. If we look at what's happening in Syria and Iran's bases and the Shiite militias and Hezbollah and all of its missiles, I mean, I think in general, out of the last 10 or so years, we're really reaching a peak of tensions. And Bibi's given this speech, and now it's up to Trump and his team to decide if they're finally going to confront the Iranians.
Right. Professor Dershowitz, what is your take also on the timing of and the kind of decision and thinking behind this presentation?
Well, I thought it was a brilliant presentation, and it certainly had a big impact on American audiences. Some of the American media tried to poo-poo it, saying that the Obama administration knew all this all the time. Well, if they did, they deceived the American public. They certainly didn't tell us. Remember that the deal starts with a statement by Iran. Iran reaffirms that it will never, under any circumstances, seek to acquire or develop nuclear weapons. I think this revelation now proves that the entire deal was based on a lie, that Iran is determined to develop and acquire nuclear weapons, and that the sunset provisions of this deal are a green light toward acquiring a nuclear arsenal. And I think that President Trump has several options. One, to nix the deal, which I don't think is necessarily the best solution at this time, although the deal never should have been enacted. The second is to demand that the sunset provisions be eliminated, and that Iran never, ever, under any circumstances, be allowed to spin centrifuges that could lead it to the capability of creating nuclear weapons. And the third is for the United States to announce that it's part of American policy that Iran will never, ever seek to acquire or develop nuclear weapons. And if there's any evidence that it is doing that, Congress authorizes the president to take whatever military actions are necessary to stop it. The one thing that is unacceptable is simply to allow the deal as it currently exists and is interpreted to go forward. And I think Prime Minister Netanyahu did a good job in showing that that's not an acceptable alternative today.
Well, we can go on about this topic for quite some time. I guess, you know, if we can just get a quick answer to what you think would happen if, in fact, the deal was nixed. What then? And what is the immediate aftermath of that decision? Do you perhaps want to start?
I think that if the deal's nixed, there is no immediate aftermath. I think that Iran will keep doing what it's already doing, which is trying to become basically a hegemon, taking over part of the region. And at some point, of course, with or without the deal, there's going to be perhaps a conflict between Iran or Iran's proxies, because Iran always likes to let other people die for it. That would be Hezbollah and Israel or something like that.
All right, well, let's turn to the future of peace between Israel and the Palestinians. The Palestinian National Council has just held its first meeting in Ramallah since 1996. Now, what are the ramifications of this meeting for Israel, especially since it's just before the American embassy move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem? Professor Dershowitz?
Well, first, the Palestinians have to come to the table. The new head of Saudi Arabia made it clear recently that if the Palestinians don't come to the table and at least begin to negotiate and try to seek a compromise resolution, they're going to lose the sympathy of Sunni Arabs around the world. That the Palestinian issue is no longer the first issue that is of concern to the Sunni Arabs. The Iranian issue is the first issue, and that Israel is a stabilizing force in the Middle East, not a destabilizing force. The Palestinians have become the destabilizing force in the Middle East. So the pressure is now on the Palestinians to agree, A, to sit down and negotiate, and to be open to accept a resolution of the kind they rejected in 1938, 1948, 1967, 2000, 2001, 2005, 2008. The time has come for the Palestinians finally to accept something that will give them a disarmed state with Israeli military presence in the Jordan Valley, land swaps, a symbolic capital in Jerusalem, symbolic perhaps right of return, but with compromises. And I think all of that is fair, and the Palestinians now have the ball in their court.
Seth, what is your response to this? Obviously, it's been quite some time since a meeting like this has taken place.
Well, it seems to me, I think the average age of that meeting or whatever was people in their 80s or something. I mean, this Palestinian leadership is on the way out. We don't see a lot of young blood. It's not really clear how there will ever be peace negotiations. It's not clear if it's in Israel's interest to have those negotiations or if it's in the Palestinians' interest. It seems to me that these will just people will just keep plodding along, absent of any sort of weird spark that leads to some sort of intifada or something like that. We're kind of seeing just the remains of the day for these kind of elderly leaders around Abbas.
But I disagree that it's not in Israel's interest to have these negotiations. It most definitely is. Israel has to come forward with a plan or accept the parameters of whatever the American plan is. Israel has to be seen by the world as offering to resolve this issue. If the Palestinians reject it, that's their problem. But Israel should not be seen as the rejectionist state. I know that President Trump is very anxious to have the Israelis accept some kind of a negotiated peace resolution, and I think it would be a terrible mistake for Israel to be the rejectionist here. Israel has to come forward with a plan that guarantees its security and leave it to the Palestinians to accept or reject.
Well, and I'm sure that you would like to respond to what the professor just had to say, but we've just seen 5 weeks of violence and clashes on the Gazan border with Israel, and they've been orchestrated to climax on Nakba Day, or the Palestinian Day of Catastrophe, which is known to commemorate the day that Israel became an official state. This is not a coincidence, but was actually planned from the outset to coincide with the historic move of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. Has Israel properly dealt with this protesting?
I think that Israel has properly dealt with it in terms of Israel's terms. I think that in terms of what the international community might see, or human rights organizations, the use of live fire to shoot protesters, some of which were journalists or were even young teenagers, is problematic. But I think in terms of what Israel wanted, which is to keep these protests away from the fence, and actually over time the violence has been reduced. Every week less people are being shot. There's smaller, protests are getting smaller. So Israel seems to have basically succeeded in what Israel wanted to do, but it's been kind of a bloody success.
I'm not going to be an armchair general and try to tell the Israeli military how to deal with a national security threat. These were not protests. This was an attempted military invasion by Hamas, using civilians as the front line of a military attempt to cross the border, and every country would repel attempts to cross the border by whatever force is necessary. If Israel could do it with fewer casualties and the lesser use of live ammunition, it would be far, far better, because to kill children plays into the hands of Hamas. Hamas has long used what I call its dead baby strategy. It puts children and women and innocent people on the front line to make martyrs and to get CNN and others to cover the dead babies and the dead children. And anything Israel could do not to play into that tactic would benefit both Israel and the interests of world peace.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time for our first interview with Seth Frantzman here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Joining us now is American historian Professor Gil Troy. Professor Troy has authored 13 books, including his latest, The Zionist Ideas. He's also a columnist for the Jerusalem Post and an esteemed professor of history at McGill University in Canada. Now, Professor Troy, I'd like to give you the stage to pose your own question to Professor Dershowitz, so it's all yours.
Professor Dershowitz, a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for being one of the Zionist thinkers in my new book, The Zionist Ideas. 1959, when that book came out, Israel was fragile, but the Zionist conversation was robust. Today, in 2018, Israel is robust, but the Zionist conversation is fragile. What's happened?
Well, what happens is what happens with every movement. When a movement succeeds, its theoretical underpinnings become less important. That happened during the American Revolution. It happened during many, many other important events in history. You need a movement to generate a state, but once a state gets established, the theory becomes far, far less important, and pragmatics and compromises become far, far more important. I think if you did a comparable history, spirit of 1776 in the United States, and then compared it to Adams and Jefferson bickering over the 1800 election, you'll see very, very, very similar changes. I think they're inevitable. I don't think they're necessarily positive. I think it's important to keep the spirit of Zionism alive. I think young people don't understand Zionism, don't understand how important it is, both in theory and practice, to be a vibrant nation of the Jewish people. And that's why I think your books and your writings have contributed so much to the dialogue.
Well, you know, that kind of leads us to our next question, which is almost natural. Why has it become almost a taboo to be a Zionist in this day and age? And can you define also what a Zionist is for those who may be confused about the literal definition?
So first, to define it, Zionism starts with the notion that we are a people. Jews aren't just a religion, but we're a people and a religion. In some ways, we're an Oreo cookie. Just like an Oreo cookie has the cookie part and the cream part, and that's what makes it an Oreo cookie. The Jews are a nation and a religion. As a nation, we have ties to a particular homeland. And that homeland and that tie doesn't necessarily mean that others might also have tie to that land. But we have a tie to that homeland. And then we can build a nation state, like 192 other countries in the United Nations have built nation states. And so it's people, land, state. That was to establish the state. And now the challenge is to perfect the state, and even more so, to also find, as Professor Dershowitz was suggesting, find meaning in that state. Mm-hmm. And why are we in trouble? Partially, I say shame on them, that there's a systematic campaign to delegitimize Israel and Zionism. But also shame on us. I think it's not only that the revolution got a little tired because it succeeded, I think we've also internalized so much of the negativity, and like oppressed Jews, rather than overcoming the attacks, overcoming the oppression, we've internalized it and said, oh, if we're so unpopular, there must be something wrong with us, as opposed to something wrong with them. And I want identity Zionism. I want us to look at Israel, look at a nation state as a source of inspiration wherever we live.
I think that's right. And I go out of my way not to call myself just a supporter of Israel, but an ardent Zionist. When I spoke in Qatar recently at Northwestern University, there were protests saying, Zionists go home. And the guy sitting next to me kind of whispered and said, well, tell me you're not a Zionist, you just support Israel. And I stood up and I said, I am a Zionist, and I'm proud of my Zionism. I think one of the problems, Professor, is with your Oreo cookie. So that in the beginning, the Oreo cookie was comprised mostly of a secular nationalism, the nation state of the Jewish people. The religious component was almost symbolic. Obviously, the flag of Israel was based on the Talit. The Star of David is a biblical star. But Israel and Zionism was a secular enterprise. And the religious component was far less important. Indeed, some very religious people were anti-Zionist because the Mashiach hadn't yet come. And, of course, the great prayer for Israel, which talks about the beginning of our redemption, was a compromise, as was Ben-Gurion's compromise about religious law with the chief rabbinate. Well, things have changed dramatically, and the religious elements of Israel have played a much more powerful role with the growth of the Haredi community, and I don't think that's been a healthy development for Zionism or for Israel. And I think for the spirit of Zionism to be restored, every Israeli can do public service, whether in the military or outside the military. Every Israeli has to be fully a participant in Israel, and I think the idea of having a group in the economy that doesn't put its weight and instead just performs religious services is a violation of Herzl's notion, which he wrote about in The Jewish State, that rabbis must be kept in their temples. And I think we see far too much influence today of religion on state governance.
I agree with you, because I think the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, have forgotten part of the Oreo cookie too. They've taken the nation part out. And the balance that I'm talking about is one that many of the Zionists did have, because you're right, there was a sense of a secular rebellion, but in many ways it was rebellion against the rabbis. And in my book, The Zionist Ideas, and I added the S as a way of broadening the conversation, religious, non-religious, left, right, people like Rav Kook, people like Rabbi David Hartman, older and younger, all say that the religious dimension was also an important dimension. We came back to this land, not just any land. We came back to this language, Hebrew, which had been the language of sacred speak and now is also the language of every day. And so it's that balance. And when I talk about religion, I don't talk about it in the sense of the way the rabbinate has hijacked it, in the way the ultra-Orthodox have distorted it. I'm talking about in the rich, full sense that you feel in Israel of a constant dance between old-new, as Theodor Herzl said, alt-neu, the old represented by the tradition and the new represented by the secular revolution, the modern revolution. And many of your writings speak to that. And that's one of the reasons why you're such a hero to so many of us on both sides of the Atlantic.
You put it so beautifully. I think that's absolutely right. But when there's a conflict between the old and the new, the old doesn't get a veto. It gets a vote, but it doesn't get a veto. And look, I'm coming to Israel next week with my grandson. The first place we're going to go as soon as the plane lands is to the Kotel. My grandson is not religious, but I wanted to see, and he wants to see, the great symbol of the Jewish past. And we'll immerse ourselves in Jewish history, religious and secular. But at bottom, decisions have to be made on a governance basis, not on a religious basis.
Well, religious or secular, there are some that assume that being Jewish means that you are inherently Zionist. Is that true?
Well, we see, for example, with these ultra-Orthodox who have embarrassed all of us with their rejection of certain core Zionist ideas, core national ideas, that you can definitely be Jewish and not Zionist. Zionism is a movement and is an idea, but I would say that to truly understand the richness and the fullness of Jewish history, the richness and fullness of the Jewish past, the richness and fullness of Jewish civilization, you need to be somewhere on the dance, somewhere with both sides of that cookie. And I hope that your grandson enjoys both sides and sees the inspiration we can get from this 3,500-year-old conversation we've been a part of.
I think you're right, but let me give you two examples, one a positive, one a negative. So take Chabad. Chabad is a wonderful organization. I've worked with it very closely on prisoners' rights, on many of the rights. Now, you cannot say that Chabad is a, quote, Zionist organization because, in theory, it doesn't necessarily accept the concept of Zionism. There's no pro-Israel organization today on college and university campuses. They just don't have a litmus test for who joins Chabad. You don't have to be a card-carrying Zionist to do. All you have to do is love the Jewish people, love the nation state of the Jewish people, and you're welcome at Chabad. In fact, Chabad even welcomes people who are anti-Zionist. But then contrast that with a horrible organization called the Jewish Voice for Peace, which pretends to be a Jewish organization. It's an anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist, anti-Israel organization, which would love nothing more than to see the end of the nation state of the Jewish people. But by calling itself Jewish, by using peace in its name, it pretends to speak for Jewish people as, fortunately, a small number of people, but its name and its label attract lots of young people because they want peace and they want to be Jewish. So this organization, much like Jews for Jesus, attracts people on the basis of absolutely false premises. So I don't think being a Zionist is the test of loving Israel, nor do I think even being Jewish is the test for loving Israel, but it is the nation state of the Jewish people.
Well, unfortunately, we are running low on time, so hopefully we can kind of wrap this up with the last question that's not too long. Professor Troy, in preparing for this program, you were looking at what direction Israel and its relationship to the diaspora should be moving. And before our show, you even quoted to me from a book written 20 years ago by Professor Dershowitz called The Vanishing American Jew. What are your thoughts on this subject, and what questions would you like to raise today?
Well, the passage came from that wonderful book, The Vanishing American Jew, and I put it in my book, The Zionist Ideas, because it really talks about the challenge that I think you'll be facing with your grandson next week, which is how do you convey Zionism? How do you explain this 3,500-year-old adventure to the next generation? And what I want us to do is not just get stuck in the politics, not just get stuck in the fight, but really talk about what I call identity Zionism, which is start with me, start with my life, start with every one of us. What are our issues? Because I think the modern Jew and the modern human being is looking for roots, is looking for community, and to look at Zionism, look at Jewish nationalism as an opportunity to root ourselves and to connect to one another and to, in some ways, address the soul sickness that not just modern Jews have, but many modern Westerners have.
I agree. I couldn't agree more. And I think the other point that has to be made is that we are living in a world which is moving toward extremes. The left is moving further left in its anti-Zionist rhetoric. The right is moving further right in some of its anti-Semitic rhetoric. And historically, Jews have always been caught between the black and the red, the black of fascism and the red of communism. And we all have an obligation to move us closer to the center. And Zionism was always a centrist philosophy. Israel was born by the pen, not the sword. It had to defend itself by the sword. It was born by the pen. It was born of theory, born of commitment, and born of desire to create a centrist, modern, liberal society. And I don't mean liberal in the sense of liberal conservative, but just open society. And I hope we can convey the true sense of what Zionism is and how proud we should all be of being part of the Zionist experiment.
All right, well, on that note, we have to end the show. It's all the time that we have for today. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Dershowitz. And of course, I would like to thank our guests, Seth Frantzman and Gil Troy. If you would like Professor Dershowitz to answer your questions, go to ILTV or our Facebook page and submit them. We'll see you again next week.